A baby was born so blue, the doctors thought he was dying. They called an ambulance and prepped a blood transfusion, but the baby was healthy. His skin was just blue. So was his great-grandmother's. So were his cousins, his uncles, and a whole branch of one Kentucky family that had been blue for almost 200 years. The doctors had no idea why. The answer was hiding in something this family had been doing for generations, something that turned their blood brown and their skin the color of the sky. Kin to themselves. Around 1820, a French orphan named Martin Fugate settled on the banks of Troublesome Creek in eastern Kentucky and married a local woman named Elizabeth Smith. Neither of them was blue, but both of them were carriers. A carrier is someone who holds a broken gene without showing it. The gene that turned skin blue was recessive, which means it only does something when a person gets 2 copies of it, one from each parent. 1 copy and you look normal. 2 copies and you turn blue. Martin and Elizabeth each had 1 copy. Their kids had a 1 in 4 chance of getting both. 4 of their 7 children were born blue. That should have been the end of it. A rare gene in a couple of children usually fades out, but Troublesome Creek had no roads and no railway. There were almost no outsiders to marry, so the Fugates married the people next door. And the people next door were often their own relatives. Cousins married cousins. They married into the same few families over and over. The Smiths, the Combses, the Richies, the Stacys. One descendant looked at his own tangled family tree and said, "I'm kin to myself." Every one of those marriages reloaded the gene. What started with one couple spread to a whole bloodline. But blue skin was only the part you could see. Underneath it, something was wrong with their blood. The condition is called methemoglobinemia. Here's the simple version. Your red blood cells carry oxygen using hemoglobin, and hemoglobin grabs oxygen using iron. In normal blood, that iron is the kind that holds oxygen tight. In the Fugates, too much of it turned into a different kind of iron that can barely hold oxygen at all. That changed blood is called methemoglobin, and it is a dark brown, almost chocolate color. Your body has a tool to fix this. It is an enzyme called diapherase, and its whole job is to turn that bad blood back into good blood. The Fugates were missing it, so the brown blood built up under their pale skin and showed through as blue. Here is the strange part. It barely hurt them. Most people have under 1% of this brown blood. The Fugates ran around 10 to 20%, enough to look blue, but not enough to do real damage. One woman, Luna, was the bluest of them all. She had 13 children and lived to 84. A nurse who saw her said her lips were dark as a bruise and called her as blue a woman as I ever saw. For over 100 years, nobody knew why. Then in the 1960s, a doctor went looking for them. His name was Madison Cohen, a blood specialist at the University of Kentucky who had heard rumors about blue people in the hills. He and a nurse hunted through the hollows until a brother and sister, Patrick and Rachel Ritchie, walked into a clinic. They were blue and they were tired of it. Cohen ran his tests and found the missing enzyme. Then came the cure, and it was almost a joke. The fix for blue skin was more blue. He gave them a blue dye called methylene blue, which does the job the missing enzyme could not. Within minutes, their skin turned pink. For the first time in their lives, they were pink. They were delighted, Cohen said. The catch was the body flushed the dye out fast, so they needed a pill every day. By then, the blue was already fading on its own. Roads, coal mines, and the railroad had finally reached the area. The Fugates started marrying outsiders. The genes spread thin, and the blue children stopped coming. Then, in 1975, a baby named Benji Stacy was born dark blue. And the doctors who had never heard the story panicked all over again. His grandmother set them straight. His father told them his own grandmother, Luna, was a blue Fugate and said the blue had run strong in her. Benji's family tree traced straight back to Martin. By 7, the blue was gone. Almost when he gets cold or angry, his lips and fingertips still turn the same blue his great-grandmother wore her whole life. The shame they carried. The blue was the easy part to explain. Living with it was not. For most of the family's history, nobody in those hills had a real name for the color. They only had the color itself, and the color was enough to mark a person for life. In a place where everyone knew everyone, a blue baby was news that traveled from porch to porch before the child was a week old. Some neighbors said the skin meant bad blood. Others believed the blue was an act of the devil, while some treated it as a racial matter. None of that was real. But fear does not need to be real to do damage, and the Fugates carried that fear for almost 200 years. So they did what frightened people do. They pulled away from the world. They stopped wanting strangers around, and they stopped wanting their pictures taken. Many of the blue family members felt so ashamed that they avoided cameras and doctors and stayed deep in the woods, afraid of being treated like a monster. Sit with that for a second. A child is born with a strong heart, good lungs, and a long life ahead of him. The only thing different about him is a color on his skin, and that one thing is enough to teach him to hide. Some of the blue people came to believe the worst about themselves themselves too. A number of them thought the color meant something was wrong with them, so they kept to themselves. When the only explanation anyone offers you is shame, you start to wear it on the inside as well as the outside. There was no doctor in the hollow to say the words that would have set them free. Words like recessive gene and harmless. Those words did not arrive for over 100 years. Here is the cruel twist. The hiding made everything worse. The more the family shut itself away, the smaller its choice of husbands and wives became. And the smaller that choice got, the more often the gene met itself again. Shame and isolation were not just side effects of the blue. They were part of the engine that kept the blue coming back. You can hear all of it in the way the family acted when help finally arrived. When the doctor met the brother and sister who walked into that clinic, the thing that struck him was not the color. It was the embarrassment. He recalled that the pair would not even come into the waiting room, that one of them stayed hunched in the hallway, while the other leaned against the wall. They were really embarrassed about being blue, he said. These were grown adults who had lived their whole lives in that skin, and still they could barely stand to be looked at. The rest of the world did not make it easier. By the time the story got out, the blue people had become a kind of attraction. A TV program once asked the doctor if it could put the family on screen as part of its weekly show of human oddities, and he refused to take part. He had seen how much the staring hurt, and he would not turn their lives into a circus act. The story goes that a film crew came all the way from Hollywood to get footage and gave up fast, chased off by the dogs that guarded every front yard in those hollows. He told that story with a grin, not because he wished the crew harm, but because he was glad the family had been left in peace. That was the heart of how he saw them. He never talked about the Fugits as freaks or as a puzzle to be solved for fame. He talked about them as people who had been dealt a strange hand and had carried it with grace. The nurse who worked beside him felt the same way about the family she had come to know. They were poor people, but they were good, she said. And poor they were. This was Eastern Kentucky coal country, where the work was hard, the pay was thin, and a doctor might be hours away over bad roads. Money for travel and specialists was not something most of these families had. So a blue child often grew up without ever learning why he looked the way he did. He simply learned that he was different, and that the world outside the creek would not be kind about it. There is one name in the family story that captures the whole sad shape of it. A man named Lorenzo Dow Fugate was called Blue Anzi his entire life because of the shade of his skin. Imagine being known forever by the one thing about you that you most wished people would stop noticing. That was the daily reality for the Blue Fugates long before any doctor showed up with a black bag and an answer. And yet, for all the shame the world piled on them, the family itself held together. The Blue children were loved at home. They married, they raised big families, and they lived long lives. The judgment came from outside, not from the kitchen table. That is worth remembering when you hear the word people still use to describe this family, a word that makes it sound like the whole thing was a moral failing rather than a quirk of geography and chance. We will come back to that word, but first there is a question the doctor still had to answer. If the cure for blue skin really was a blue dye, then how on earth could that possibly work? Why a blue dye fixed blue skin? The fix sounded like a joke, and the family said as much. A doctor walks into a poor mountain community, looks at people who have been blue their whole lives, and tells them the answer is to put more blue into them. Some of them thought he was a little crazy for suggesting a blue dye could turn them pink. But it was not a joke, it was chemistry, and once you see how it works, it is one of the neatest tricks in all of medicine. Start with what blood is supposed to do. Your red blood cells are packed with hemoglobin, and hemoglobin holds onto oxygen using iron. The iron has to be in just the right form to grab oxygen and carry it. Doctors call that the ferrous form. Normally the iron in hemoglobin sits in that ferrous state, and it is the form that binds oxygen and moves it around the body. When everything works, your blood is bright red and your skin looks pink because oxygen is flowing freely. Now here is what went wrong in the Fugates. A small amount of that iron is always flipping into a second useless form, called the ferric form. Useless iron cannot carry oxygen. In a healthy body, this is no problem, because your cells have a cleanup crew whose only job is to flip the bad iron back into the good kind. That cleanup crew is an enzyme. The enzyme is called cytochrome B5 reductase, and in healthy red blood cells, it converts the ferric iron back into the ferrous iron that carries oxygen. The Fugates were born with too little of it. So the bad iron piled up faster than their bodies could fix it. Their blood filled with the brown, oxygen-poor form, and that brown showing through pale skin reads to the human eye as blue. This was a famous puzzle in science long before it ever reached Kentucky. In fact, this exact condition was the first inherited disease ever traced to a problem with one specific enzyme, first worked out generations earlier by a scientist named Quentin Gibson. So the doctor was not guessing in the dark. He knew the chemistry. He just had to prove the family had the enzyme problem and then find a way around it. This is where the blue dye comes in. Your body actually keeps a backup system for fixing bad iron. a second pathway it almost never needs. That backup just sits there idle, waiting for a spark. Methylene blue is that spark. The doctor knew the body has a second way of turning the bad blood back to normal, and that switching it on means adding a substance that acts as an electron donor. Methylene blue is an electron donor. Drop it into the blood, and it wakes up the backup crew. The backup crew flips the ion, and the blue drains out of the skin. He chose methylene blue in particular because it had already been used safely in other cases, and because it works fast. When he finally gave the dye to the brother and sister, the change was almost instant. Within minutes, the gray-blue washed off their skin and left them pink for the first time in their lives. There was only one catch, and it is the reason the cure was not a one-time thing. The body does not hold onto methylene blue. The dye leaves through the urinary tract fairly quickly, which is why the effect is only temporary. As it passed through, it tinted their urine a startling blue-green, a small price for a lifetime of pink skin. To stay pink, they had to take a tablet every day. Skip the pill long enough, and the blue would slowly creep back. Now for the part of the science that explains why the fugates were, in a strange way, lucky. There is more than one version of this enzyme problem, and they are not equal. The version the fugates had only affects the red blood cells. In this milder form, the enzyme shortage shows up only in the blood, and it produces color with almost no real harm, which is why doctors describe these patients as more blue than sick. That is the kind that lets a woman like Luna bear more than a dozen children and live into her 80s while looking deep blue the whole time. But there is a second, far worse version. In that one, the same kind of enzyme is missing from every cell in the body, not just the blood. The more severe form affects all the cells, comes with serious brain and nerve problems, and is usually fatal in the first years of life. Children born with that form do not grow up to be local legends. They do not survive. So when you look at the blue fugates and see people who lived long, full lives in spite of their color, you're looking at the gentle version of a gene that in its harsher form kills babies. The blue you could see was the harmless part. The harmful part never made it into this family at all, and that is pure luck. The blueness itself follows a simple scale, and the fugates sat in the safe zone of it. A healthy person carries almost none of the bad blood. The fugates ran high enough to look blue but low enough to stay well. Color becomes visible when the bad blood reaches about 10 to 20%. Levels above 30 or 40% start to cause real trouble like breathing problems and seizures, and levels over 70% can be deadly. The family lived its whole strange history inside that lower band, blue to the eye and healthy in the body. It is one of the rare cases in medicine where the scary-looking symptom is the mild one and the dangerous version stays hidden, so the dye was never magic. It was a doctor borrowing a backup pathway the body already owned and lighting it up with a spark. The cure for blue was blue because the chemistry demanded it, but none of this explained the bigger mystery. The enzyme problem is rare. Two carriers finding each other should be a long shot, so how did one little creek end up with a whole population of blue people? The answer was not in the blood, it was in the map. They were never the only ones. To understand the blue fugates, you have to stop thinking about one family and start thinking about one road that did not exist. For most of the family's history, the land around Troublesome Creek was about as cut off as a place in America could be. There were no real roads, and a railroad did not reach that part of eastern Kentucky until around 1910. That single fact shaped everything. When you cannot easily leave, you marry whoever is near. And near, in those hollows, meant a handful of families who had all settled the same few creek valleys. The Fugates, the Smiths, the Combses, the Richies, and the Staces. Generation after generation, those names married back into each other. Over enough time, a community like that stops being a set of separate families and becomes one big tangled bloodline. Geneticists have a name for what happens next. They call it the founder effect. The idea is simple. Imagine a tiny group of settlers starts a new community far from anyone else. Whatever genes those first few people happen to carry, common or rare, become the entire starting deck for everyone who comes after. If one founder happens to carry a rare hidden gene, that gene does not get watered down by a big outside population. Because there is no big outside population, it just gets dealt again and again to their descendants. A rare gene in the wide world can be a common one in a small, closed community, purely because of who showed up first. Think of it like a deck of cards that never gets reshuffled with new cards. In a giant casino full of thousands of fresh decks, drawing the same rare card twice in a row almost never happens. But in a tiny room with one small deck that keeps getting dealt over and over, that rare card turns up again and again. Troublesome Creek was the tiny room. The blue gene was the rare card. And for almost 200 years, nobody brought in a new deck. Now add marriage between close relatives, and the effect gets stronger. Remember that the blue gene is recessive, which means a person needs two copies to turn blue, one from each parent. In the open world, the odds of two carriers meeting and having children are tiny. But when cousins marry cousins, both parents are pulling from the same family deck. So the chance that both carry the same hidden gene shoots up. The Fugate family tree shows this in black and white. One of Martin and Elizabeth's blue sons, Zachariah, married his own mother's sister, which is to say his aunt, and that close pairing produced one of the most strongly blue branches in the whole family. Every marriage like that loaded the dice a little more. Here's the part that surprises most people. The Fugates were never special. The gene that turned them blue was not a Kentucky gene or an Appalachian curse. It is a quiet passenger in human populations all over the world, and wherever people have lived in small, isolated groups for a long time, it has surfaced in the very same way. The same enzyme deficiency shows up in clusters among the Athabascan people of Alaska, the Navajo, and the Yakut people of Siberia. Different continents, different languages, different centuries. Same gene, same isolation, same blue. And this is not just a tidy coincidence. It is the very thing that cracked the Fugate case. When the doctor first tested the brother and sister, he expected to find a certain kind of abnormal blood, and the test came back negative, which sent him back to the medical books. There he found a study of an isolated native population in Alaska whose blue skin came from the same enzyme problem, and that study pointed him straight to the answer for the Kentucky family. In other words, the blue people of a cold Alaskan village helped a doctor understand the blue people of a warm Kentucky hollow, because nature had run the same experiment in both places. The report he leaned on described hereditary methemoglobinemia in an isolated Alaskan population that, like the Fugates, had a long history of marriage within the group. This is the real lesson hiding inside the family story, and it is bigger than blue skin. Every one of us carries a few broken genes we never notice, because we hold only one copy and our partner carries a different set. Out in a large, mixed population, those hidden genes almost never line up. Isolation is what lines them up. It is why small, closed communities around the world, kept apart by mountains, by oceans, by language, or by being pushed to the edges of society, often share rare conditions the rest of the world almost never sees. The Fugates are simply the most colorful example in the most literal sense of the word. So the blue did not come from anything the family did wrong. It came from a rare gene meeting an old map. A few founders, a deck of genes with one unusual card, 100 years with no new players, and a few cousin marriages to stack the odds. Run that math long enough and you do not get a curse. You get a pattern. The same pattern that has painted people blue from the hollows of Kentucky to the edge of the Arctic. There was only one direction the story could go from there. The thing that made the blue was isolation. And isolation was about to end. The last blue baby. Nothing killed the blue. The roads did. For all the science and all the dye, the thing that finally drained the color out of the Fugate line was not medicine. It was the outside world arriving. Once the coal mines opened and the railroad pushed into the mountains, the walls around Troublesome Creek came down. As mining and the railroads brought change to the region, the blue Fugates began moving out of their old communities and marrying outsiders, and the inherited blue started to disappear as the recessive gene spread into families where it was unlikely to meet a matching gene. The math that had made the blue now worked in reverse. Every marriage to an outsider was a fresh card in the deck. The rare gene did not vanish. It just got spread so thin that it almost never found its twin anymore. And then, in 1975, it found its twin one more time. When Benji Stacy was born in a hospital near Hazard, the doctors who delivered him had no idea what they were looking at. He came out a deep, dark blue, so blue that one description had his skin looking as blue as Lake Louise. The doctors were so alarmed that they rushed the newborn by ambulance from the maternity ward to a medical center in Lexington, and 2 days of tests turned up no explanation for his color. A blood transfusion was being readied. These were modern doctors with modern training, and they were as frightened and as lost as any midwife in the hollows had been a century before. The science had been solved. The memory had not reached them. It took the baby's grandmother to calm the room. She asked the doctors a simple question, whether they had ever heard of the blue Fugates of Troublesome Creek. Benji's father explained that his own grandmother, Luna, had been a blue Fugate, and that the color had run strong in her. The family tree traced the boy straight back to Martin and Elizabeth, with Fugate blood coming down both his mother's side and his father's side, which is exactly why the old recessive gene was able to pair up in him after skipping so many. Once the doctors understood, the panic drained away as fast as Benji's color soon would. Because that is the thing about Benji, the blue did not last. Within a few weeks, his skin faded, and he grew into an ordinary-looking boy, with only his lips and fingernails turning a purple-blue shade when he got cold or angry. He had likely inherited only a single strong dose of the trait, enough to color him at birth, but not enough to keep him blue for life. The medical students who had crowded around the strange blue newborn, trying to get a look, watched their famous patient turn into a regular kid. The legacy of Martin Fugate had shrunk down to a flush of color in a child's lips on a cold day. There's a quiet joke in where Benji ended up. He grew up and later made his home in Alaska, the same northern country where the very same enzyme gene had turned other isolated families blue, the families whose medical story had once handed the doctor his answer. The boy who carried the last famous trace of the Kentucky blue went to live near the home of the Alaskan blue. The gene had come full circle without anyone planning it. As for the doctor, he did not get to see the rest of the story. Madison Cohen died in 1985. But the family charts and blood samples he gathered helped sharpen the understanding of recessive diseases, the kind that only appear when both parents quietly carry the same broken gene. He had set out chasing a local curiosity in the hills. What he left behind was a clean, human-sized lesson in how heredity works, taught through one family that wore its genetics on its skin. Now, about that word. The story is often sold with the idea that this family was so inbred their skin turned blue, as if the color were a stain of shame, a punishment for marrying wrong. That framing is cruel, and it is mostly wrong. The blue did not come from sin or filth. It came from a rare gene that happened to ride into one isolated valley, a place with no roads and no way out, where the only people to marry were the people already there. The same thing has happened to communities all over the world who had nothing to do with the Fugettes, and the gene itself in the form this family carried was almost entirely harmless. These were healthy people with strong hearts and long lives who were treated as monsters over a color that never once threatened them. As one hematologist put it, the story shows the intersection between disease and society and how much damage misinformation and stigma can do when nobody bothers to learn the truth. So the real answer to the mystery is gentler than the title makes it sound. A French orphan and a local woman, both carrying a hidden gene, met on the banks of a creek with a fitting name. The creek kept their family in. The gene kept turning up, and for almost 200 years, a whole bloodline lived under skies the color of their own skin. Then the roads came. The deck got reshuffled, and the blue faded into history, leaving behind only a boy's cold weather lips and a story that still sounds impossible. The Fugates were never cursed. They were just isolated, unlucky in their odds and lucky in their health, and far more ordinary on the inside than the world ever let them be. The blue was only ever skin deep.